Well, there are some things that you can kind of imagine that just from the history of Paul, you can suppose some things. For one thing, Paul had people who were constantly trying to ruin his name. And by ruining his name, they would ruin his ministry. There were people who constantly tried to take the words of his ministry and warp what he really said into what they want him to say. You know, there's just a lot of things that happened to Paul on his journeys that this Alexander could have done to him.
The other place where the name Alexander comes up, whether or not it's the same person, is during the course of when he was dealing with what we call the Judaizing teachers. The people who were coming behind him and saying, you know, you can't just obey Paul's gospel teaching. You've got to go back and get circumcised and begin obeying the whole Old Testament law.
Unfortunately, Alexander's not a Jewish name.
Well, but Alexander, the other Alexander, if it is another Alexander, is in Acts 19. During the time that Demetrius and the silversmiths were fussing, because they dragged a Jewish leader named Alexander into court thinking that he was part of it. And then they released him and, kept going after Paul. That's what you read about in Acts 19 with Demetrius and the silversmiths. All this happened in Ephesus. Whether that's the same Alexander or not,
very common. Whether it's not, the warning is specific. You need to be on guard against him.
Yeah.
You need to be on guard, and we all have to be on guard against false teachings. If it doesn't line up 100% with the Bible, New and Old Testament, it doesn't line up.
If there's somebody who did great harm, he must have been twisting it just a little bit. I mean, otherwise he wouldn't have to be aware if he was just saying something that, was obvious balderdash.
Yeah.
Probably just twisted it just enough to make it.
And you can also take from the verse 16, is it? Yeah. That he probably wormed his way in with Paul. But then when Paul's trial came up, I got nothing to do with him, man.
Yeah.
The thing we can take away from this is how Paul treated the situation when he said about this Alexander did me a great deal of harm. Then he says, Jehovah will repay him according to his deeds. There was nothing vindictive in anything Paul says here. He's not holding against him. He's just stating the facts. And just as he says, Jehovah will repay him according to his deeds. If you look at, I believe it's Psalm 62:12, it says, also loyal love is yours, O Jehovah, for you repay each one according to his deeds. So that's no doubt what Paul had in mind. So he's leaving it to Jehovah. It kind of reminds you, too, where Jesus Christ was beaten, and spat upon, and ridiculed by the crowds. And what was Jesus' response? He prayed, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they are doing. He did not take it upon himself at that time to judge those people.
And that's a common thread you'll find throughout the Bible, is that when someone is being martyred, and even throughout church history, when someone who is truly a follower of Jesus is being martyred, they ask God to forgive them. They ask God not to hold this charge against them.
Mm-hmm. I think there were believers that just disappeared because of all that Paul was going through. And so he didn't want that to be held against them. They were still believers. They got scared and ran off.
Even like he says, when Christ was on the cross, they weren't believers. When Stephen was being stoned, they weren't believers. It's a common thread throughout church history that those who are really walking in the Spirit during their martyrdom, they ask that nothing be held against them. They ask that, it's always the common thread that follows through.
Well, they
After
decided
Peter
to
said, "I'll be with you till the end," he said, "No, the cock will crow."
Right. Now, the Lord also said,
Right.
vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord.
But remember what came from down here. They wanted the Lord to rain fire and brimstone in that town because they weren't receiving the gospel.
Right. Yeah, but they were corrected. They were corrected.
Burn them up.
Remember, the Lord is still willing. This Alexander, as as he's being spoken against here, he still had the opportunity to repent and come to Christ before he died.
Right.
Whether he did or not, we, of course, have no way of knowing.
And the interesting thing about what you were saying there, Steve, was James was the first one killed of the apostles.
And when they threw out the temple, didn't they?
No, this is
Herod had it
killed
killed.
This is different James.
Oh.
James, brother of John. He was the first one killed. He was killed by sword.
In that verse 16, where it says, "In my first defense no one came to my side, but they all forsook me. May they not be held accountable." There again, Paul's, not personally holding against him. He's asking God not to hold against him. And because I think Paul perceives this as what we talked about was last week. This would have been an unfavorable season. It would have been a difficult time to stand up and speak on behalf of Christ at this time, considering what was happening to Paul in that first defense.
What if that cloak looked like a monk's robe? I want one.
I would imagine so. One of the things that we, if you study other places, you'd find out that the trade unions were highly tied to pagan worship. That's the nature of it. Because a lot of the stuff you made was for pagan temples and pagan idols and stuff. So the trade unions that Paul belonged to, he was a tent maker, but people who made stuff and sold them on marketplaces. The trade unions were heavily tied to pagan worship. So
Especially goldsmiths, silversmiths, coppersmiths, they were images of the gods.
Whatever Alexander was, that he was heavily influenced in the trade unions in pagan worship.
Going to lose money.
Well, yeah, and that's the reason why. People were upset with Paul.
Drag him before the courts there in Ephesus.
Isn't it interesting that even in today's world, there are certain trade unions that are the same?
I retired from the trade union. It's just amazing how unions have become so liberal, so anti-God,
Can I ask a question that would be a question that would be asked today, and it's probably facetious of me to ask?
Why shouldn't that be anything?
Oh, yeah.
Who's the one
When
driving?
he's talking about Alexander here, isn't he judging him because he sins differently than he does? Just wondering, because that's what people would say nowadays if you talked against somebody that was talking against false doctrine. Don't judge him because he sins differently than you do.
Yeah.